Jagath Jayasuriya was the security forces commander of the Vanni region, which saw the most horrific scenes of serious violations of international humanitarian law and serious violations of human rights law during the final stages of the war in Sri Lanka from 2007 until 2009. Following the end of the war, Jagath Jayasuriya was actually rewarded and appointed as Chief of Defence Staff of the Sri Lanka Defence Forces, eventually acquiring the appointed as to the rank of General. And following his retirement from the army, he was then further rewarded by being appointed in several ambassadorial roles in Latin American countries, including Brazil, Colombia, and Chile.
And Rawan, rights groups accuse the Australian Federal Police of failing to investigate him when he visited in 2019. Will there be an inquiry into this, do you think?
Well, that's what we're calling for, because we think the response from the AFP was really unacceptable. I think if we had been in Europe and we had made these serious referrals of serious allegations of international crimes, European jurisdictions with active war crimes units wouldn't have responded in the way that the Australian Federal Police responded. We had alerted them that he was coming. We had strong reason to believe that he was coming. And in the end, unfortunately, we were right and nothing happened. And Jayasuriya was able to roam freely in Melbourne and attend events in Melbourne and talk about the legacy of his war career, a career which, in wartime, which, as we alerted to, includes serious allegations of crimes. We're talking about attacks on hospitals in the Vanni region. Unfortunately, during the final stages of the war, no hospital or medical facility was spared from bombardment, shelling. There was allegations of use of white phosphorus and cluster munitions. He was also the commander of the Army's garrison known as Joseph Camp, which was in the town of Livonia. And that camp is widely known as Joseph Camp, and it was notorious and is still notorious for serious violations of human rights, including torture and sexual violence that was carried out against detainees in the camp there.
And the AFP has since said that the Sri Lankan Domestic Commission of Inquiry and War Crimes is the most appropriate body to assess this sort of allegation. What's your response to this?
Well, we would reject that assertion, and I think it's clear that they won't probably, in reading our responses to them, we've provided, in fact, the United Nations Human Rights Council and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has no confidence in the Commission of Inquiry that's being set up. That's because it's not independent, it's being set up by people who should themselves be investigated for serious allegations of crimes. So we reject the assertion that the Commission of Inquiry is the appropriate place. It's neither independent nor credible, and there will be no accountability.
And you're calling on the government to impose sanctions on him under the Magnitsky Act. What kind of sanctions and what effect do you hope these will have?
Because the AFP failed to investigate, we are now calling on the Australian government to impose sanctions against Jagath Jayasuriya and his immediate family members. As you'll recall, Australia introduced the Magnitsky legislation last year in December, and that allows for targeted targeted sanctions against human rights abusers. And we think that Jagath Jayasuriya should not be allowed to enter Australia unless it's to arrest him and put him on trial for the allegations of serious crimes against him.
And Rawan, there are many victims and survivors of the Civil War, which lasted decades from the early 80s. Some live here in Australia now. What are their thoughts on this case?
I think that they would be seriously traumatised by the fact that Australia had let in somebody who is directly responsible for the trauma and the crimes and the violations that they suffered. I think that this is something that the Australian government needs to take into account when considering whether to sanction Jayasuriya, and they need to ensure that victims here too have rights. There is a really strong Tamil Australian community who's been fighting for justice for a very long time, and there's a sizable refugee community, victims of Jayasuriya, who sought haven and safety in Australia after the end of the war. And so the knowledge that Jayasuriya was allowed to enter the country freely without any scrutiny or attempt to address an answer to his crimes, I think is abominable.
And more than a decade after the end of the Civil War, what are your hopes in holding perpetrators to account for the atrocities committed?
Unfortunately, in relation to the crimes alleged that occurred in Sri Lanka, there has been no accountability, no genuine attempt at accountability. And so universal jurisdiction, which is what we tried to do by making that request with the Australian Federal Police in 2009, is really the only available mechanism now available to survivors and victims of the crimes that occurred at the end of the war and during the Civil War. And so unless governments are willing and able to prosecute and put on trial individuals associated with these crimes, most primarily they are the Sri Lankan generals, then we need to look at other ways to undermine the impunity that these people continue to enjoy. And that includes imposing sanctions and preventing them from travelling and enjoying the privileges of countries like Australia.